Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in about 4 minutes. We're glad you're here. Hi, everyone. We are so excited that so many of you could join us for our webinar today, and we're going to get started in 2 minutes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I'm still watching the room fill up a bit, so I'm going to give just another minute to let folks join the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, we want to welcome you to today's session. That's part of a larger series that's offering mental health and suicide prevention information, support, and resources in response to the global pandemic. We've been doing this well-being series for several weeks. We know that some of you have been joining us for many of the sessions that we've been providing. And we also know that this may be the first time that you've joined us for one of our well-being series sessions. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the well-being series and about our sponsors and provide some information to you about your role as a participant today. So my name is Kelsey Schmitz, and I work for the University of Washington at the SMART Center, the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. I'm the School Mental Health Lead to the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that, but our center is located in Seattle. The Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the UW SMART Center are partnering with several Northwest organizations, such as Forefront Suicide Prevention Center, Association of Washington School Principals, Dr. Jim and Liz Mazza, who created the DBT in Schools curriculum, Northwest Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports Network, Sound Supports, and Well Educator, to bring you this well-being series that's offering a variety of virtual learning opportunities for kids, for families, and educators, focusing on mental wellness and suicide prevention. Today's session is focused on ambiguous loss and grieving in the time of COVID-19. This webinar will give you an overview of what grief looks like at any time, but especially during a time of ambiguous loss. We'll talk about how to care for yourself and others during a time of uncertainty. Our presenter will provide content for a little over an hour, and then we're going to leave the rest of the time for Q&A with our presenter. You should have all received a link to the PowerPoint in your pre-event email from Zoom. If not, we have my colleague Megan Lucy, who's going to post a link to that PowerPoint so you have access to that before we get started. So you can learn a little bit more about the rest of the Wellbeing series by visiting the website and checking out some of the other events that have already occurred and events that we have planned. Any of our events that have already occurred have been recorded, so you can access those recordings and the presentation materials, as well as links to future events on our website. And if you have questions, you can reach out to my colleague Megan Lucy, whose email is on this slide. All right, next slide. So just a little bit about the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network. It was funded by SAMHSA, which stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, in late 2018. The MHTTC network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. We know that many of you are joining us from outside our region, and we want to make sure that you know about a center that's closest to where you are, where you can access additional training and technical assistance. Next slide. The Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center supports the school mental health workforce in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And this is how you can get in touch with our Region 10 Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer School Mental Health Center. This lists our website as well as a link to sign up for our newsletter. And we'd also love to connect with you on social media. Again, if you can access the chat, you'll be able to see some links in the chat that you can go to for additional information. Next slide. So this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording. You will receive a link to where that will be posted as well. Participants for this webinar are all muted and all your videos are off. I want you to take this moment to take note of the toolbox. It is either located at the top or bottom of your screen. You should see some similar icons to the one on the slide. And we want you to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. We have reserved quite a bit of time with Charlene at the end of this presentation for questions and answers. So as you think of things, go ahead and put your question in that Q&A feature. The chat box for today will only allow you to chat with panelists, will not allow participants to chat with one another. Next slide. So we will ask you towards the end of our time together, whether you have to head off after the content portion and can't stay for question and answers, or if you're staying for question and answers, we're going to provide a link for you in the chat box. And we just ask that you take a few moments to complete the evaluations. Our evaluations are required by SAMHSA, our funder. We use that information to make decisions about future events. We also know that it helps communicate the need for this type of support that supports our funding. It's voluntary. You don't have to do it. We do really appreciate it. It does just take a couple minutes, and it is anonymous. Next slide. So now I want to tell you a little bit about our presenter today and hand it off to her. Charlene Ray is a licensed independent clinical social worker and has been in practice as a therapist, mentor, grief counselor, and workshop facilitator for 35 years. She teaches mindfulness in the school, K through 6, and facilitates mindfulness-based stress reduction for teachers. She's led programs for school districts on various mental health topics and is a frequent speaker at Snow Isle Library Issues That Matter events. She works for Forefront Suicide Prevention as a school coach and as a trainer. And so at this point, I want to invite Charlene to join us, turn on her video, and we're glad you're here. Thank you so much to you and your Forefront colleagues for being such great partners in this well-being series.
Thank you, Kelsey. Everybody can hear me and see me okay, I hope.
Yeah, you look and sound great.
Oops. My slides already getting excited and advancing. Let's go back here. So I want to welcome everyone and thank Kelsey and Megan and all of the people who've helped me work on this presentation for making it possible today. And thank you to each one of you who are here to listen to this topic. This is a passion of mine, and I hope that that will come across and that you will leave feeling inspired. I feel like many of us are grieving right now. We're grieving people who have died, and in many instances, not having had the opportunity to say goodbye, or for us to be with them, or anyone to be with them in their final moments. We're grieving not being able to have an in-person presence to support one another during this time. And we're grieving our rituals, our routines, the familiarity of our day-to-day life. And for those of us who have a history with grief, especially the unexpected kind, we may be having grief from those losses stirred and reawakened. So there's a lot that we're dealing with. So I'm really glad that you're here. And I know you're here for many reasons: your own healing, the healing of others, and because you may not have been taught how to understand and be with grief, because it's painful and we try to avoid what's painful. It's natural. So today I invite you to just be with this material and be with grief. And I want to tell you a little bit more about why I'm leading this training. Kelsey said some very nice things in the bio, but I've walked alongside many individuals and groups supporting those who are grieving over those 35 years that she mentioned. I have worked in schools, and I have assisted schools in learning how to support grieving students after the loss of a family member as a result of tragic deaths like accidents, murder, and suicide. And I'm passionate about holding space for grief and for teaching others how to do so. I'm interested in making space for grief of all kinds, to encourage conversation about grief, and to impact change in the way that our culture often tries to avoid grief. So I'm very glad you're here. And I'm here because I work for Forefront Suicide Prevention, which is a center of excellence at the University of Washington, whose focus is reducing suicide by empowering individuals and communities to take sustainable action, championing systemic change, and restoring hope. So I'm grateful to Forefront for helping me put this presentation together. So I really want to highlight taking care of yourself during this training and afterwards. We all love, so we all grieve, and this material can be triggering for some. And right now we all are experiencing some type of grief, and we want to be mindful of how we're doing throughout the training. So really take good care of yourself. Maybe share with someone after the experience today, how it was for you, something you've learned. And also, if you can, avoid multitasking today. I know that we all are in a lot of Zoom meetings, and Zoom meeting fatigue is a real thing. And I think it does help if we're not multitasking. And I also feel like this topic really deserves our full attention. And so I hope that you will be with me throughout this whole presentation, as present as you can be while taking care of yourself. And as Kelsey said, we'll have time, plenty of time at the end for more conversation and for your questions too. So here are our learning objectives for today: to define ambiguous loss, to identify the signs and symptoms of grief, to understand the difference between grief and mourning, to identify ways of coping with grief, and to know when and how to ask for support. I will also have some information after those objectives on how to support children who are grieving. I know that many of you work with children and have children at home, and hopefully that information will be of support and help to you too. I also wanted to mention to you that this may be a little different than other webinars for you. It's certainly different for me, because when I talk about this topic, generally, I can see your faces and I can engage with you in this important conversation. So I'm not seeing you. I can feel you all out there, but it's so you're all sitting there with this topic, mostly probably by yourselves. And you will get information. You will hopefully learn some new things or remember some things. And probably just as important, if not more important, you will be asked to reflect on your own experience. And that, I feel, is what's very important and maybe different about this seminar than some others you might have taken on grief in the past. But let's look at a definition of grief. So one of the many excellent grief experts, and there are many out there, is Alan Wolfelt. And this is a definition of grief that he offered during this time. As human beings, whenever our attachments are threatened, harmed, or severed, we naturally grieve. Grief is everything we think and feel inside of us when this happens. We experience shock and disbelief. We worry, which is a form of fear. We become sad and possibly lonely. We get angry, we feel guilty or regretful. The sum total of all these and any other thoughts and feelings we are experiencing as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is our grief. And he has said we are experiencing a grief pandemic. One thing I want to point out about this in this definition is that grief is natural. As he says, we naturally grieve. Grieving is natural, it's necessary. And you might hear me say it many times that we grieve because we love. And the only way to avoid grief would be to avoid love. And then we would also lose our access to joy. So this webinar is called Ambiguous Loss. So what do we mean by ambiguous? Why not just loss? Ambiguous loss is defined as an unclear loss that defies closure. And we use a lot of words to describe that. Unclear, inexact, having a different meaning, obscure, indistinct. Pauline Boss, who is probably one of the leading experts on ambiguous loss, she writes in her book about a couple different types in her books. One is when a person is physically present, but psychologically absent, such as in dementia. And the second type is when there's a physical absence, but an emotional presence. So, and that could be like if there's a complicated relationship with someone that you've been maybe estranged from, but you still have that emotional connection, or maybe someone is very far away, and you can't be with them. So we've had some of that kind of loss lately, that kind of ambiguous loss. And I feel like the pandemic has brought forth a lot of ambiguousness in all of our lives. But as I have in this slide, if we think about grief and ambiguous loss, there's a lack of closure. We have this unknown quality to our future. We don't know the answers. We're searching for answers. Our feelings can be complicated. Sometimes we don't quite know what they are. And we may have this feeling of being stuck or living in limbo. So what's not ambiguous about this loss is that it's affecting everyone in some way. It is a global grief pandemic. So I think the question then is, are we recognizing this loss? And are we aware that some of the things that we may be feeling or have been feeling over the past 10, 11 weeks may be stemming from grief? I also want to make sure that we don't minimize the loss and grief of that may be experiencing at this time, not necessarily related to COVID, but there are deaths of loved ones that are happening for all kinds of reasons, from an elderly loved one, or from cancer, from accidents, from suicide. So we want to be sure that we stay aware that all losses during this time are not the same, but that we're all experiencing some kind of loss. So let's take a deep breath, because that feels like that's already been a lot to just take in. I like to use a lot of imagery and nature in my work, and taking a lot of deep breaths in the grief journey. And these pauses really allow us to slow down, to breathe more deeply, to be gentle with ourselves, because the grief journey can be a long road, as I'm sure many of you know. So here's where I ask you to begin to check in with yourself about what you've been feeling over these last weeks. What are the feelings that have been filling your heart and your mind as you've been looking at the news, as your life has perhaps abruptly and dramatically changed? Your day-to-day activities are not the same. Maybe you are socially isolated from friends and family. Maybe everybody's all been together for too long in the house. And you've been experiencing probably a myriad of feelings. Many people that I've been working with, my clients, have reported some of the most common things: confusion, foggy brain, sadness, anxiety, anger, despair, feeling like you don't know what day it is, feeling uncertain about everything. And I guess the question to me is like, so is this grief? Could all this be grief? Is some of it grief? I feel like it's not so important that we distinguish what parts of it are grief, but that we acknowledge that there are the losses and that there is grief present at this time. Here's another quote I like. The source is unknown, but the quote is, "Grief is not linear. It doesn't start strong and taper off with time. Rather, it is like a storm that grows smaller or larger in the same day, and often within hours." Important to remember, this is true for all kinds of grief. It varies from person to person. moment to moment. And every time you grieve, it's going to look different. One of the things I feel like it's very important to distinguish is the difference between grief and mourning. So grief is the inner experience of loss. This is the simplest way to say it. Grief is the inner experience of loss, and mourning is the outer expression. So how do we know that we're mourning or that someone is mourning? Right now, if I could see all of you, I may not know whether you're grieving. I may not know what's in your heart and what's happening for you and what losses you've experienced. But if you started to cry, or you started to tell me a story about someone who's died, or a graduation that was canceled, or wedding that's not going to happen, I might know that you are mourning a loss because you're starting to express that outwardly. If you started to show me photos of your grandmother who had just died, or your dog, or that has passed away, I think that then I might know that this is the way that you're beginning to move the feelings of grief from the inside to the outside. And mourning is essential for healing. It's very important that we are able to move our feelings, and so that they don't get stuck and we don't get stuck. We're going to pause for a moment here to talk about death during this time. So not every one of us has lost someone to death in the past 10 or 11 weeks, but some of us have. Some of us have lost a loved one. Someone has died because of the virus, and some because of other causes, unrelated. Perhaps a sudden medical emergency, could be suicide, could be after a long-term illness. We are all experiencing different losses. There may have been an inability to be with that person, as I mentioned at the beginning, or due to hospital restrictions or travel restrictions or health conditions or other reasons. There could be this lack of ability to have a ceremony or support one another after the death of someone during this time. So it's really important to think about, what can we do? How do we create ritual and ceremony to honor the one we have loved and lost? How do we mourn? So you'll notice in this webinar, I'm asking a lot of questions. I have a tendency to do that a lot because I want you to really think about things and think creatively, and think deeply about them. So a lot of these questions you will answer later, most likely. You'll have more time to reflect and to think about them. But I just want you to just think about this for a moment. If you have had a loved one who's died during this time, how have you created a way to honor this loss? And are you mourning? And I hope that those are some questions that you'll all take with you for yourself and for others you are supporting. So in this grief conversation, we're going to take a look at these stages that many of you may be familiar with, that came from Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's work. She first spoke and wrote about these stages related to dying, and later talked about when she was with David Kessler, partnered with David Kessler to write on grief and grieving, to talk about these stages related to death, to death and to grief, yes. They were never intended, in either case, to be a linear process, although many people still get confused about them and feel like they are stages that you go through in a linear order. But that is not the case. I present them to you now because I think they're familiar to most people, and you could probably see yourself in them related to this pandemic, and probably see how many people started off in the denial place with the pandemic really kind of confused perhaps, or in shock, and lots of fear, not knowing what to do. I think a lot of people went from denial then over to bargaining, trying to kind of go, wait a minute, this can't be true. Maybe life could be normal. Do we really have to close schools? What do we really have to do? So there was, and then I think people have had varying stages of a lot of feelings, not just anger and depression, obviously, but a lot of feelings in between. And it's true for any kind of grief that it's not linear, but as I'm talking about it, relationship to this pandemic time, I think it's important to kind of think about yourself and the people around you. And sometimes I think we can understand each other's behavior and feelings, and how you might have had an interaction with someone and thought, wow, they're so irritable. They're so upset, all of a sudden, what's going on with them? But if you pause for a moment, you might think, oh, they're really struggling to find, like, what does this mean? This is a result of not having a job anymore, or working at home suddenly and trying to figure out how to do that with the kids around. So I think we can have a better understanding and more compassion for one another when we have this kind of a frame of reference. I also want to mention here too that David Kessler is a well-known grief expert and does a lot of great work on grief. And he has recently written a book, published the book. It's been written, I think, for a bit, but published, called Finding Meaning, in which he talks about a sixth stage in this grief cycle, which is finding meaning. And it's it's an excellent book, written very well, that I do recommend. So we talked about this a little bit already, that these stages are not linear. And some people use them, some people don't. I sometimes talk about them in my practice. A lot of the times I'm just being with someone where they're at, which is more of my approach to grief. And so in that, sometimes we might talk about the feeling of denial, or the feeling of being angry about the grief, but not really referencing the stages so much. But I think like I said, I think they can form a good reference point for people, because so many people tend to be familiar with them. One of the things that I feel like is that, we're often numb and in a daze in the early stages of grief, of all kinds, really. And I especially felt that I experienced that myself, and I know a lot of people who felt that way in the early stages of this pandemic time that we're in. So another moment of reflection. So to think about where you see yourself in these stages, this is just a moment to actually ask yourself, how am I, right? If these were just guideposts, you might just wonder, like, well, how do I feel? How am I these days? Where am I at with this in this time? And am I feeling like I'm grieving, or was I grieving? Am I still there? And are past losses stirred up for you? Lots of people have been talking about death and losses that happened many, many years ago. And you might have that feeling like, haven't I already healed from this? Why am I suddenly thinking about my father who died 45 years ago? But it's like an onion with many layers. Grief never ends. Most people know that you don't get over grief. You learn how to live with it. And so other losses bring up another layer. And so I look at it, of course, because I live and love this world and this work, as an opportunity to go a little deeper, because I feel like each of those layers reveal something to us about ourselves. So it's good to ask yourself too, how is this grief similar to or different than grief that I've experienced in the past? And again, these will be things that maybe you'll start to reflect on now. And as you go about the next few days, maybe something will come to you that might be an answer to one of these reflection questions. And I like this illustration because, again, this sort of talks about that. We would really like grief to be linear, like that straight line. But how grief actually works is more like the other picture right there. And anybody who's experienced grief can tell you that that is true, that it is more up and down and roller coaster all over the place. And all in one day, sometimes in 1 hour. So let's take a look at some of the common signs and symptoms of grief. And this is not just during COVID. This is grief at any time. And there may be many others, but I did choose to highlight the ones that people have been talking about with me over the last 10 weeks as the most common ones I've seen reported during this time. As you can see them there: exhaustion, confusion, trouble making decisions, difficulty coping with feelings, immovable sadness or irritation, anxiety about the unknown, numbness, physical aches, pains, and soreness, and overwhelm. So what do we need right now? This is probably one of the most important questions that you can ever ask yourself. It's a way of being compassionate and kind. We're often very good at asking others, what do you need? But not as good at asking ourselves, what do I need? So I just put that there as a question that you can ask yourself as a frequent and helpful mantra right now, is to ask yourself, what do I need right now? So this coping with ambiguous loss is a little different because of the uncertainty, because sometimes that can feel unbearable. It can be often more intense if we have a history of a lot of uncertainty in our lives. It can just bring up all of those feelings. And many people can cope by trying to control as much of their life as possible, sometimes to try to create more stability and certainty in an uncertain situation. And sometimes some of that can be helpful. And sometimes we try to do that to avoid feeling the intensity of the loss. So really, we want to just, how do we cope with it? And so we definitely have some guidance for you on that. These are some guideposts I like to use with my grief clients and in workshops and groups that I lead to serve as a guide for those who are grieving. I see myself more as a guide on this journey than a counselor. And these are not stages, they're not linear, although acknowledging that this is grief is often the first part of the journey. And you may know, it may be clear to you that if you've had a lot of loss, that grief is a part of what you're going through. But what might not be clear is some of these other things of how to honor your grief and how to allow yourself to feel the feelings and to nurture yourself and to reach out for help when you need it. And then eventually to find hope. And you may feel like you're feeling better for a few days. And then suddenly there might be a song, a poem, the sight of your loved one's favorite cereal on the shelf in a grocery store that just sets you into a time of deep grief and crying or just feeling the loss in your heart. So grief is definitely not a certain process, predictable and linear, as I've said. But one of the things we want to do is identify that this is grief and to name it and to be able to say, it's okay, that this time is necessary for me to say this is grief and to allow myself to have my feelings. And I think that really kind of having, some people it's come in those realizations that, well, life may not go back to normal, and maybe it's gonna be different now forever. And so that often comes with acknowledging grief. It's like when you know that a person is not coming back, and that you have maybe done some bargaining and some wishful hoping that they will, and that's all part of the process too. But at some point we really acknowledge that this is grief. So we're going to take a moment here to do a poll and see how you have been affected by loss during this last 10 or 11 weeks. And we're going to have you answer some questions, and then we'll see what results we have from the people who are here, just to get a sense of how much we're in this together. So I think that probably takes a minute, huh, Kelsey?
Yep, we're getting it pulled out.
It's a good time to check in with yourself.
All right, so people should start seeing the poll. And it looks like we're starting to get some data coming in. So we'll give it a few minutes and let most of our folks have a chance to answer. Then we'll end the poll and show you the results. Okay, we got about 65% in, a little bit over that. So I think we'll go ahead and end it. And everyone should be able to see the results now. And Charlene's going to talk through these a bit. And then if the poll doesn't go away, when we stop sharing it, you can click the X at the top of your screen, the poll screen, to make it go away.
Yeah, so I see that we have had some people who have lost a loved one during this time. 32%, and many people have experienced the loss of an important celebration. We have 69% have experienced that kind of loss of wedding, graduation, important family celebration. Not too many people have lost their jobs or home, which is good, or their relationships. But look at that, loss of social gatherings with friends and family and vacations and sports and all the things we love. 98% of people, and 83% are supporting someone else through a loss. Bless you for that. Yeah, so that's helpful for me to see too. So thank you for participating in that. Hopefully that was helpful for you too, to see our common humanity. Oops. So again, here's a little moment of reflection to think for a few minutes on how your life has changed in the past month, and allowing yourself to acknowledge the present of the loss. And something you might want to do later is to make a list of the losses that you've experienced. Not to dwell on the negative, but to honor them. To really, I feel like it's the way I work with wounds in trauma. It's like we just want to hold them up as if they were holy, and honor them. And so every feeling you can imagine is a part of grief. So we've talked about many of them, and it's common to feel all of them. And you have maybe noticed this. I know I have, and people around me have definitely noticed it. And we've all noticed that we're feeling different things when we're experiencing grief. And so there's never a need to fix that. There's no need to fix grief. We need to be with grief and to listen to grief and to feel our feelings. It's also important that we remember that your grief is your grief. This is not a competition. There's no bigger grief than, or smaller grief. It's your grief. And we each experience grief in a unique way. And each time you experience it, it will be different. So I hope that you all feel like you have permission to have your own unique grief experience. And I feel like all of these things that I'm sharing with you, they feel simple to me. I don't know if they're profound to you in any way, but I know that they are helpful when you share them with someone who is grieving. These are the kinds of things that are, when you think about, well, what do I say to someone? How do I really support someone who's grieving? These are the kinds of things that people who are grieving say are helpful to them. So this one goes into a little bit more about the uniqueness of grief. And so there are many factors that influence that. So your unique personality, we each grieve in different ways. We grieve how we live most of the time. If we cry a lot to release feelings, you'll probably do that a lot when you're grieving. But crying is not required for grieving. Some people like to get very quiet and withdrawn, and they might do that in other times in their life when they're faced with a challenge, and that's their unique way. If you're alone, you may experience loneliness, or you may feel like if there are many people in your home, you may feel like you don't have space enough to grieve. Your cultural or spiritual background may have certain beliefs and traditions regarding grief that will also influence your way of grieving. If you're experiencing multiple stresses in your life, it may intensify your grief. And if you've experienced loss in the past, the grief, like I had mentioned before, from the past may come bubbling up once again, or sometimes for the first time if you stuffed that grief in the past. And there's no right or wrong way to grieve. So this reflection is just something for you to think about for a bit. Grief is not meant to be experienced alone. So how do we grieve in community when we're socially isolated or physically isolated? And to think for yourself right now, what ideas might you have for that? There may be, our culture is still learning about grief and how to talk about it and how to support the grieving. We've made some progress, but we still don't give enough time for grief or teach people how to hold space for others who are grieving. And this time has presented many challenges. And we talked about before, funerals and memorials that have needed to be postponed or done online, or creative ways. And one of the things that we want to make sure is that when we postpone rituals and ceremonies, that we're not then delaying mourning, which is, as you remember, is how we express our grief. So thinking again, what ideas you might have about how we can mourn together and share the grief experience during this time. I'd love to hear about some of those. Maybe you can send them to us at the end if you come up with some ideas. So one of the guideposts is to nurture yourself. It's important to give yourselves more space, more time than you usually do. When we're grieving, our normal day-to-day self-care may not be enough. You need to have permission to rest, to say no when you need space, to feel, to think, to be. I use a lot of mindful self-compassion and practicing mindfulness as a way of doing this. And there are several areas where we want to pay this kind of gentle attention to ourselves. And we're going to go through those right now in a bit more detail. One is our bodies, nurturing our bodies. Your body often lets you know that it's experiencing grief before your mind even registers this fact. It could be a headache. It could be an upset digestive system. Some people literally feel the heartache. Could be having trouble sleeping, could be not being able to get out of bed. It could be fatigue and low energy. You may be surprised by how much rest your body needs during grief. And unmetabolized grief or unexpressed grief can get stuck in our body. So this is another reason why it's important to allow space for grief. And often our body wants to expel the grief through, crying or movement or shaking. Many people, when they get the news of a loss that's very significant and traumatic, the first response of their body is to shake as a way of really beginning to release the feelings, and so that it doesn't get stuck in the body. So it'd be good for you to think about some ways you might nurture your body, or that you are nurturing your body. And that could be things like eating well, moving your body. Maybe it's not moving your body as much and you need to rest more. Drinking plenty of water, creating breaks to be outside, get fresh air, and to notice, pay attention to your body. Notice and listen to the signals that your body is giving you that something is up. And then we talk about nurturing our mind. It may be difficult to think clearly. Some people talk about this as called grief brain, which is where it just feels like it's foggy, it's overwhelmed, it's confusing, the thoughts are not clear, it can be difficult to focus. This is a good time to ask that key question, what do I need right now? And also another question that might help you is, what is being asked of me today? And those can help you focus when your mind is scattered. And you can make a list of goals and actions to take. That is often helpful, but it's also good to make sure that you take time to just be. As I said earlier when I was talking about how we try to control our feelings, many people cope with grief by doing, and sometimes it's good to just stop and allow the mind to rest as much as it can. I know that sometimes it keeps going. And then our social self. This one's tough right now because physical touch is so important to us as humans. Hugs or hand on the shoulder, our being able to be with each other and our energetic presence, being together. It can be hard to not have that. So I feel like I'm so grateful that we have technology, because we can see our family and friends on Zoom and FaceTime and calling each other on the phone. And some people have been writing good old-fashioned cards and letters, which are fun and nice to receive. So it's good to think about ways that we can nurture this part of us during this time. And we also notice that introverts have tended to do a little better in isolation because they recharge internally. And extroverts recharge, they recharge with people. They need others. So it can be especially challenging for them to be away from that kind of contact. So it's good to be aware of that when you think about, am I an introvert or extrovert? And what do I need? Who are the people in my life and what do they need? I think it's also really good to think about who you can count on to be there for you. Who will listen to you without judgment or trying to fix you, especially when you're grieving. This is important. We all need someone who will sit with us, be there with us in our darkest times without trying to change anything, just to be present with us. And then we want to nurture our heart and our soul. I mentioned mindful self-compassion. It's one of the best ways to nurture your heart and soul, which is really, mindful self-compassion is just really this quality of attention that you give yourself when you're being very kind and tender toward yourself, which, many times we're not that way towards ourselves. We are that way with our friends, but not so much for ourselves. So it's important to practice that if we can now. And also really helping others as well. I think that can be a helpful thing if we can reach out to someone else and in a mutual exchange, if we have some people where that feels like it's, we're having those heart conversations with someone we care about. So this is another spot where you could later reflect on what nurtures your heart and soul, and make a list and try to choose something every day that brings joy to your heart. And there's a few things there: that reading poetry, listening to music, praying or meditating, getting outside. These are all of things that can nurture the heart and soul, and we could make a list of hundreds of them. But it's just important to for you to make your list and choose something. Grief is I really think of grief as a form of gratitude for being alive, because we have that grief response when we lose things we love, and we lose things that we cherish, or someone or some being. And it's I think it's we don't think about it all the time, because we're thinking about the pain of grief. We don't think about the aliveness and the joy that's why we grieve. And that when we get to a place where we have integrated our losses, our joy can be even greater. We have greater access to it. One of the things I find very helpful for everyone, but especially for grieving, is being in nature, the healing power of nature. Nature is such a powerful support. I often write nature prescriptions for my clients. You'll see some nature prescriptions right there on the slide. Things like take a 10-minute walk once a day to look for signs of hope in nature. Stand with your back against a tree and feel its steady support. Walk or sit at the beach, close your eyes and listen to the waves. In your imagination, allow them to wash over you, soothing your soul. Nature is stress reducing, increases oxytocin, relaxes the nervous system. It's a healing modality you can feel the effects of immediately, because it is hard not to be altered by gazing at full moonlight, watching a sunset, standing in a forest as the light streams through the trees. And one of the things that I always remind people is also that nature is big enough to hold your grief. You can feel yourself being held by the forest, held by the magnitude of the ocean, and you can cry, you can have whatever expression of grief you need, and nature is just there with you. It's very powerful healing. This is a little something that I often do with clients that I offer to you, that you can do later if you'd like, on a piece of paper, or on your computer. You can create a plan to nurture yourself using some of these suggestions that we talked about. This one has broken it down into 3 areas: mental, physical, and emotional, with a good reminder that self-care is not selfish or self-indulgent. We cannot nurture others from a dry well. We need to take care of our own needs first, then we can give from our surplus, our abundance. Jennifer Loudon. And I think that I like to do this I personally like big paper and colorful markers, and then hanging it in a place where I'm going to see it frequently. So I'm reminded on a daily basis to take good care of myself. So I highly recommend that. One of the other guideposts is reaching out for help. So it's important, as I said, that grief is not meant to be experienced alone. We need someone to listen to our grief and to reflect back to us that it matters. And there are a number of ways to do this, and each person will have a different comfort level and a different need. A good friend can be a good place to start. They can be a lifeline, someone who listens and supports you, as I mentioned before. Perhaps in these times, some people have been talking about having isolation buddies, where you agree to check in, send funny pictures to one another, send a good morning text, have Zoom coffee, tea time, just to be connected. And then there are many ways to seek counseling support. Lots of groups on social media, Zoom groups that are happening during this time. These are just a few websites where counselors can be found, but there are plenty of others, and there's going to be some more resources coming up here for finding support. These are the suicide prevention lifeline, and that is also in Spanish and also for veterans. And then we have the crisis text line. These are important numbers. I recommend you put them in your phone. And also reminding us too that, you know, working with our grief, expressing our grief is suicide prevention, because that we don't want that grief to get stuck in us, because that's when we can start. Grief can lead to depression. When you're grieving, you are not necessarily depressed, but it can lead to a place of being depressed. And then it can lead to those places of feelings of hopelessness, and feeling like life is not going to get any better, and I'd be better off if I weren't here. And so we really, this, all that we're talking about here, and tending to our grief, I see as a very powerful way of suicide prevention. And here's some more resources and hotlines. You might take a picture of this. I think you're going to get this whole presentation at some point, but these are some very more specific resources and hotlines that are helpful to have. Just wait a moment in case anyone's taken a photo of that. And another moment of reflection. So who, just for you to, if you didn't think of someone already when I asked this question, now's another good time to think of, who can I turn to for support right now? And make a plan to reach out to them. And if you're feeling like you don't need support in this moment, just knowing who they are is helpful. And then also thinking about, who could I check in with today? Who could I text or call after this presentation, just to send a caring message, just to say, I'm thinking of you, you matter to me, how are you feeling? I care about you. And just think, if we all did that, you know, there's hundreds of us on this call. If we all do that, how many caring messages did we just put out into the world? And then maybe that'll inspire them. It's the pay it forward, right? I think that's what it's called. And then we could just get hundreds of caring messages, and it really does make a difference. So the guideposts of finding hope. On the journey of grief, we look for signs of hope. We look for places of growth and beauty, gifts of the heart, soul gifts that rise to our awareness, that call us to live a more awakened and fuller life. So the path to hope begins with acknowledging our loss and allowing space for our feelings. Then we catch a glimpse of the light in the darkness, and we nurture ourselves. We reach out for support. We listen. We're present for others. And then we might notice that we become more able to enjoy life. We become a bit more able to adapt to the changes around us. And eventually, we begin to find meaning and gifts in our experience. Hope is the feeling you have that the feeling you have isn't permanent. Jean Kerr. I just like to let this quote wash over me, because it just really reminds me of that feeling like the ocean. You know, the tide comes in and out, the feelings will come and go. And when we can feel that, we know we're accessing our hope. Another point of reflection: if we were together in a smaller group, we'd be taking much longer time to really spend time and share with one another the answers to these reflection questions. But for you, I want you all to have this information, so later you can think about this too. What are some signs of hope that you can recognize? What are some gifts that have come out of this time when you've been isolating and during this pandemic time? What are some of the gifts that are coming that you want to take with you into your life? As I said, I want to spend a few minutes, check our time. I think we're doing fine. I want to spend a few minutes talking about companioning children through grief, because just like us, children are unique and each child will go through grief differently. But there's some things that I like to encourage the adults, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a sibling, grandparent, a mentor, to do when you're companioning children at this time. So let them lead, I think, is important. We have a tendency to ask a lot of questions and try to direct the conversation around grief with children. And I tend to try to, there's paper and crayons and storybooks about grief and things that would spark conversations. And then I just let them lead. I might also, it doesn't mean you don't ask any questions, but it's more stopping, paying attention, noticing where they're at and how they're receiving those questions and whether they really want to have this conversation right now. I encourage a lot of questions, asking them to be curious, asking them to notice their body, their heart, their mind, and checking in about that. I feel like being patient is really important. Welcoming their feelings, welcoming your own feelings, being honest with them, being direct, not using vague language, and including them in conversations age appropriately, of course, but not leaving them out of conversations. And then, probably one of the most important things you can do for companioning children through grief is to attend to your own grief. And there are a number of things that influence grief for children. So these are some more questions for you to think about. What is their support system like? You may be, if it's your child, you may have a really good idea of what that is like and know that that's good. But if it's a child in your school or who's a patient of yours or clients, you may not have this, that may be a good question to think about. What's happening at home for that child? Are there adults that are emotionally available to them? How is the child open to seeking support from their family? Are they allowed to talk about the loss at home? Are they allowed to mourn? Are they encouraged to mourn? Is it okay for them to talk about that? Young children, as many of you may know, they're often very quick to say, what's true and real for them. And it can make some of the adults uncomfortable. If a child sees you in the grocery store and comes up to you and says, my daddy died, and starts telling you what they know about it, it can be very uncomfortable for them. But it's for other people, but it's one of their ways of mourning, by telling the story. And they do want to tell the story, and they do want to express their feelings, and need permission to do so. And we want to be careful when we're working with or being with grieving children that we're not imposing our beliefs on children. And we don't tell them what they should feel. And we don't say, I know how you feel. Don't say that to anyone, actually. But each child is unique, and each experience of grief is unique, just like it is for you. So we want to really meet them where they're at and just be present and encourage them. And it doesn't mean they don't care if they don't show their feelings. They, just like adults, they may want to avoid the pain, or they may be more introverted or incredibly shy or incredibly anxious, or, any number of things. And so we want to be careful to not interpret that a child that doesn't show feelings doesn't mean that they don't care. They often also act out, as many of you know, to get our attention. And again, same is true for them, that grief is ongoing, doesn't go through specific stages or end at a specific time. And it's very helpful to tell children that. Children find a lot of comfort and relief in knowing that that is true. And school is important to them. So some structure is important, but it doesn't have to be too rigorous right now. We know that their social and emotional health is what's most important. I also mentioned answering questions as honestly and direct and also as simply as possible. most children, especially young children, don't need all the details, don't need the whole big story, and they're not even asking for that. They just want the simple answer, and you can elaborate if needed. And also recognizing that laughter and play are part of grieving for children and adults. And children tend to get back to it quicker than adults do, because laughter and play is their natural language. So they could be sad and having a sad feeling and a memory in 1 minute, and then, seconds later they're in the midst of a game or they're laughing about a joke. And so all of that is just part of the journey. One of the programs that I find very helpful in working with children is Art with Heart. They have a lot of fabulous materials for, all kinds of work with children, but they're a Seattle-based organization, many resources, many trainings. You can go to their website to check them out more. This book called Draw It Out is one that's about grief, that's helping children with grief, and there's a couple examples. So there's one reflection where it helps, you can invite a child, this is great for adults as well, to draw or write about a day that made things different. What is important about that day? So that can be really, really valuable experience for any of us to do. And then also the me time is another activity where you write or draw things that make you feel better when you feel sad. And that's sort of the child version of that self-care wheel that I shared with you. Many, many different activities that we can do with children and families. Another quote I like: grief and gratitude are kindred souls, each pointing to the beauty of what is transient and given to us by grace. Patricia Campbell Carlson. A gratitude practice is something that supports healing and grief. That could be as simple as sharing at the dinner table, could be writing 3 things that you're grateful for in a journal, could be saying one thing before bed at night with your children. And any way that you would like to do it, it's a wonderful practice. Children love it. You can do it alone as an adult, or with your child, or as a whole family. Gratitude is a powerful practice in healing. So here are 5 needs we all have right now. 5 of many, most likely. One is to acknowledge our feelings, to have support and be witnessed, to practice that good self-care and nurturing, to practice kindness with ourselves and others, and to have hope for the future. Just a few of the many needs. When I do this presentation live, I often lead a short meditation for a steady heart. But here I'd just like to mention that many people find meditation and mindfulness practices valuable during times of grief. It can calm us, soothe us, ground us when things are painful and chaotic. These practices support a steady heart, which is what I mean there is just an ability to be connected with our heart and ourselves. And you can find wonderful meditations on the internet, on YouTube and websites. I particularly like Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, Tara Brach, Rick Hansen, Shauna Shapiro, Chris Germer, so many. You probably could give me another list of 10 more right now. So many wonderful teachers, but I invite you to explore that a little bit if you are interested. So how shall we live now? Grief changes us. This time of being in liminal space at the threshold of a life we do not know yet changes us. Life as we knew it has changed. There's no going back. Having experienced what we have just experienced over the past few weeks and knowing what we know now, life will be different. So when loss happens, there always seem to be gifts that appear. And again, it's a question to think about. What are the gifts? How might we live differently? What hopes do we have for the future? There's a few additional resources. There were a lot more on the slide that I that I had. So I'll make sure you get those, because in addition to these two, there is the Center for Loss, also Francis Weller, Refuge in Grief. There's also the Grief Recovery Method. There's, you can go to my website as well, but we'll make sure you get those. And of course, animals can be very helpful, as most of you know. So in summary, grief is a normal response to loss. It's natural, and it can be complicated in times of uncertainty, when a loss is sudden and traumatic, and when multiple losses occur. I hope you will really get that your grief is your grief, and you have permission to have it. And grief is the inner experience of loss. Mourning is the outer expression, and mourning is essential for healing. Grieving takes however long it takes. There's no timeline. There's no linear stages. There's no getting over it. Self-care is important, especially when grieving, and that children have unique needs when grieving, and grief is not meant to be experienced alone. So today, some things you can do. I've given you many things you can reflect on and make lists of, and you can acknowledge and feel your feelings as they come up. If you are grieving, give yourself space and time to grieve. Practicing kindness and compassion with yourself and others is probably one of the most powerful things we can do. Connecting with others that can offer you support, and being a supportive listener for others when you can. And nurture yourself. Spend time outside. Enjoy the beauty of the world, and share this message of hope. Here's a poem to leave you with. I use a lot of poetry in my work too. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. This is a poem I learned after my father died when I was 13, and I recited it many times as I sat in my backyard near my favorite tree, looking for signs of hope, watering the earth with my tears, looking for a way to make sense of an incredible loss. The presentation you've experienced today and all my work is one of the many gifts that came from my early journey with grief. And I do hope it's been helpful to you in this challenging and uncertain time. I want to thank you for being here, and thank you for your kind attention, and thank you to Forefront. And here is how you can get some more information. If you want some more information about Forefront, there's the address at the UW and the website and Facebook and Twitter. And you can also send Emma at Forefront, our training manager, any feedback or questions you have pertaining to the training, or if you want to get a hold of me, that's one way to do that, or you can go to my website. But I thank you very much, and I think I'm going to turn it over to, or Kelsey's going to join us for question time.
Sure, thank you, Charlene. We're going to take this moment to transition. So if you're able and would like to stay with us for some questions and answers, we have about 20 questions right now. So if you have others, please take the time now to submit those. And we'll work through as many as we can for the time that we have left with Charlene. So we're going to transition now into that. I want to give you just a few reminders about the Wellbeing series and other ways you can connect with us. First and foremost, though, just want to thank Charlene for that incredible presentation. You know, it was really, I don't know if heartwarming is the right word to use, but when I saw the poll results and just thinking about just all of us experiencing some level of grief, and then your sort of call to action to reach out. Like there were nearly 300, still are nearly 300 people on today. And I think I love that call to action, that if each of us, I already have, by the way, could just reach out to a couple people to say, you matter and I care about you and I'm thinking about you. You know, what a difference that could make to 300 other people in addition to ourselves. So thank you for sharing that. I also wrote myself a nature prescription. So thank you for that wonderful idea. I'll be writing one for everybody in my family as well. So that was great. So many great takeaways, and just appreciate you being with us, and just want to invite folks that are joining us today to continue to connect with us. For those of you who are just now hearing about our Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, we are funded for a few more years, so and we hope that funding continues. So we will continue to be around through and past this pandemic, and want to continue to be a resource for all of you. So this slide just is reminding folks about the Wellbeing series. And if you go to the next slide, this is how you can reach out to us. My email is there, Megan's email. Megan's been putting links in the chat for other ways you can connect with us. And then since some folks have to leave, we want to remind you that the link to the evaluation is in the chat. And if before you head out, you just click on that link and take a few minutes to fill that out, we would really appreciate that. And I think the next slide is just the evaluation slide. Yep, just that reminder. And then the slide after this, so this is just our guidelines. So we're going to start answering, asking the questions that are in our Q&A, and remind you to put your questions there. And just a few other reminders, just be respectful and courteous when asking your questions, and to remember that this is a public webinar. We are recording. We can't guarantee the privacy of your questions. So if you put something in there and need to recall that question, if you could chat to us in the chat box, we'd be happy to pass over that one. And then just a reminder, if you're concerned about yourself or a loved one, to call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline or your primary care doctor. So I think now we will take the opportunity to ask some questions. Charlene, are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Stop sharing so now I can see you and hear you too. That's easier. Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to scroll back up through these questions. So in thinking about loss, what about the process of losing, where the person, place, or thing is not yet gone but slipping away? Is that still considered ambiguous loss?
Yes, I would. Yes, I mean, the easy answer to that is that yes, that's one of the kinds of ambiguous loss that that we refer to, and I'm not sure if when you say slipping away, I'm thinking like I think of dementia and Alzheimer's, and I mean there could be other things, brain injuries and other things, and ways in which people are in a coma, just lots of ways in which that loss is it's ambiguous because they're still there, but they're not there in the same way with you. And oftentimes you can't really communicate, or if you can, it's, they may forget in the next moment. And it's very, very hard. And that's why there's a lot of support specifically for people going through that kind of loss. Groups and especially support groups can be helpful, because then you can talk together about how that is. I find that really important.
Next question. Can people mourn privately, meaning it is not visible to anyone? Not everyone feels comfortable mourning publicly.
Yes, well, publicly, I think the mourning doesn't have to be seen by anyone. My example, I know I said if I could see you, then, but you could be doing all those things to mourn in your own home by yourself. You definitely can mourn privately. It's the main part of it is the movement of the feelings, that they're not stuck, that you're actually feeling them and expressing them somehow. And all of that could be done privately. I mean, I think that it's we're, you know, in the way that most people who work in grief say we're not meant to grieve alone. It's just because support can be really helpful during the time. And a lot of cultures, grief is definitely not a private thing in many cultures. One of my teachers, Sabon Fusome, she's she has died, but she was from Burkina Faso, and in her community, and grief was a very loud and outward experience. But even within that, you know, and when I would talk to her about it, she would say some people would be more do a lot of the grieving by themselves, like under a tree, you know, with their face in the ground, and then come back to the community. So. And I feel like if I don't answer, feel free to kind of make another comment if I'm not answering your question directly. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but.
Someone just commented, I find myself fearing the potential loss of highly at-risk and elderly family members, the heartbreaking possibility or likelihood of not seeing them again, and have avoided calling one because I can't bear the thought of it being the last conversation, and just feeling horrible and want to overcome that fear.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, that's so understandable. And thank you for sharing that. That's hard. I mean, I think one of the ways I think can overcome that fear too is to kind of to have self-compassion, you know, for yourself, for having it, for having the fear, for being able to just say to yourself, this is really hard. And then I also sometimes, when I'm working with people, I ask them to kind of ask themselves, well, if your elderly, grandparent died and you didn't have a conversation with them, would you be okay? You know, would you be okay with that? Or is it worth the risk of having that conversation, even if it's the last one, because you could have a conversation and maybe it won't be the last one. So there's lots of ways to offer you support with that. But I thank you for asking it or making that comment, because I think that's I think a lot of people can relate to that.
How can I cope and navigate the grief cycle when I randomly move around in the cycle each day?
Yes. I'm having that kind of expression of, because I understand that it is so hard to cope with it sometimes and navigate, because it can be all over the place. That's where I think support can be so helpful, because you can get some really specific tools, like what to do during this roller coaster ride that you're on. You know, sometimes even knowing that it's a part of the process can be helpful to, when I show my clients that diagram of this is what grief, really looks like, they go, oh my gosh, yes, that's me every day. And then there can be just this feeling, the more I think you just acknowledge the loss and that you get the support to be with the feelings, it tends to shift a little bit, and so, I mean, I think that's a short answer to I'd like to spend more time with you. I probably would like to spend more time with each and every one of you, but more time with you on kind of talking with you about that. I feel like there are a lot of good resources, though. Any of the websites that I mentioned will give you some more information about that too. But just acknowledging that that's what it is like the first step too. So yes, thank you for that.
So there's a question, you mentioned a book that references the 6th stage of finding meaning. What was the name of that book?
That book is called Finding Meaning. That's the title of it, and it's by David Kessler. And that's an excellent book.
All right. How do you show up and be there for someone else who is grieving?
Yeah. So I think many of the things that I've shared with you today, if you share with someone who's grieving, I think like the guideposts and and the nurturing them yourself, I think those things are helpful to someone who's grieving, so you can share this information with them. I also think that the most important thing you can do is listen, is to just be present and to just say, I'm here for you. I'm here for you. I know I can't fix this. I can't make, your grief go away, nor would I want to, because I know it comes from how much you love this person or this being or whatever it is that they're grieving. But you could just being there for them. So listening and showing empathy, I think, are probably the most important things. Not sharing our own experiences of grief. That's not usually the time to do that. That could be later. Not trying to fix it, not judging, right? Not trying to minimize it or to try to, to do anything other than just reflecting back what they say to you as you listen with, with presence. I think that's, and then sharing this information if it's, can be helpful to. I often find that sharing poetry, if people are open to it, there's a lot of grief poetry, and sharing that with someone who's grieving can be really helpful, because poets seem to be able to put things in words that we can't quite do. They can do it so well. And for some people, it just like goes straight to the heart, and it might be hard to hear, but it's just like, oh yes, someone understands what I'm feeling. And that's, I think, a very powerful way to help someone too.
So this question's a little bit similar, but how do you support someone who shows signs they're grieving but isn't open to the idea that they're grieving, especially if you're quarantined with them?
So they're showing signs of grieving, but they're not ready to say, I'm grieving, right? They're not acknowledging. Then I think that, yes, you just, well, you could share that you went to a grief webinar and here's some information I learned. That's one thing. But I think that you just be with them and whatever you're seeing in them, that if you know that you have a good idea that that's what's going on, you just can be with them and do that same kind of listening and, and then I always get curious with people too, like just asking, do you think this might be, you've had a lot of loss, or this was a big loss. Do you think this might be grief? I learned something about grief at the seminar, and then you can share some things. And sometimes that's, if you come about it in, kind of a gentle way, some people are willing to say, oh yeah, maybe that's it. But you just follow their lead. And sometimes, sometimes it takes a long time before people are ready to experience, express their grief.
You mentioned unmetabolized grief. Can you share a little more about that concept?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I think about it, really, when I'm referring to it is more about like not expressed grief. So hasn't been moved. It hasn't been, so it's not, metabolized, meaning like it hasn't been moved through the body and out, and expressed. So it's often like stuck, can get stuck in, sometimes people it'll get stuck in a physical symptom for people. Like they'll wonder, why am I having headaches every day? Or why am I, my body is so sore every morning, and they don't connect it to the loss. But once you do, then it's metabolized, it's moved through. It's like the awareness moves it and kind of pushes it through and out. That's mainly what I mean when I say that.
Charlene, you talked about your experience working with schools and districts, and I'm wondering if you can share some helpful or useful strategies or just some considerations for any educators or folks on the webinar today that might work with schools about things we need to start thinking about now as schools reopen in order to be prepared to support our grieving students.
Yeah, and I see a lot of school districts doing this already. I think really thinking about how are we going to make sure that the social and emotional needs of the students are met. So whether that be through thinking about the programs that you already have in place to do that, or bringing in more social emotional learning. And many of you know about the CASEL, CASEL. They are Center for Social Emotional Learning. They have a lot of really good resources, and I think that they're also, I saw something that was that they were developing something related to returning to school to address some of those things. But I think some of the same things that I mentioned in the presentation would be helpful, which is really allowing space in the beginning to talk about it, to have this space to be able to encourage questions and to welcome their feelings. And, how was that? Because we have some opportunities to do that, but if we get back together in person, it's, when we don't know what that's going to look like. So we might be asking them, how is this, what we're experiencing? If it's some hybrid program or some, it's going to look different everywhere. And just the most important thing that we want to do is to talk about it and not, just go about this new normal way that we are together in school without really calling it, and what it is. So I would really suggest that if your teacher or counselor, that you create some opportunities in the beginning to talk about what it was like and what it's like now and how they're feeling and, and what's important. And again, what did you learn from it? What did you miss? What were the struggles for you? What were the gifts? What did you, were there some things that even work better for you that that you liked being at home, and just to create that space for it. And I think also to I know it's hard. Schools are places where academics have to happen, but I also think that if we can give a little grace in the beginning, like many school districts are doing now, to the adjustment and the transition. And maybe maybe there would be some ceremony or some, honoring of that as schools come back together.
What suggestions do you have for people who are struggling with nurturing self when they are now responsible for taking on more caregiving responsibilities? For example, kids aren't in school, increased work responsibilities, working at home, homeschooling, etc.
So how do you nurture yourself in the midst of all of that life, right? That's happening. Yeah, sometimes it has to be small, right? Sometimes they're small things. I feel like there's, sometimes that's the first place I go with people, is to think small instead of a big self-care plan in the beginning. Maybe it would be like, okay, I'm just going to step outside for a moment and look at the birds because that's what I love to do. Or I'm going to bring all the kids out with me, or everybody outside, and we're all going to find a different flower, and we're going to, describe our flower. So there's lots of ways you can involve everyone in it too. So I think but I also think that even when you're involving everyone, which is great, like gratitude practice at dinner, or everybody takes a walk at the beach together, it's also important to say what you need. Like, well, I'm going to try to get up a half hour earlier because then I can write in my journal, and have some quiet time or meditate, or I'm going to get 5 minutes of mindfulness while the baby's napping, or while or in between Zoom meetings, or whatever it might be for you. So I say, think small, but, rather than I can't do it at all, I always say, think small. So that would be just a very beginning suggestion. Each one of these questions we could spend another hour on, really. They're great questions.
So you mentioned not to say, I know how you feel. What would be some things to say instead of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would just ask, it's more of a question than it's how do you feel? It's kind of how do you feel? And if you want to share how you feel, if it's appropriate, you can say, I feel this, but mostly I think and that's great in a reciprocal place, right? Where you're together and you're sharing. But if you're supporting someone, it's more about how do you feel? And it's, I'm here for you. And I'm so glad you told me. And, I want you to know that I'm, you can call me anytime, or it's those kinds of things. But I think if, sometimes in our friendships, and it's if we can relate to what someone has said, then it can be an appropriate time. And it's just to check in with yourself. Is it appropriate for me to say how I'm feeling right now? Or is it more appropriate for me to hold space for how they're feeling, and I'll have my chance later? So it's kind of that discernment that we do when we're sitting with someone.
How do we know, or what are some indicators suggesting we've given students sufficient time for processing grief before moving to problem solving? Something adults tend to jump to far too quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And I think that it's hard to know, right? That's the reality too. It's hard to know how much time is the right amount of time, especially if you have a group of children, or even if you have 3 or 4 children in your family, or 2 children. They're each going to respond differently. But if you have a classroom of children, I think it's more of a sense of probably allowing, some space in the beginning, and then knowing it's going to pop up in various points, and that some children are going to need more than others. And I also feel like if we've had an experience of collective grief, that when we've given some space to share it, and then we get on with problem solving or the lesson or whatever is happening, and someone acts out, or someone gets irritable, or someone starts to cry, that the first thing we have to think of is, oh, I need to check in to see if this is related to this collective loss or grief, and before I just feel like it's, they're upset, just like we would also check in, are they hungry, are they angry, are they tired, are they lonely, all the things that create emotional outbursts in us and children. So I think that's a tricky one, because what we'll probably find ourselves doing is kind of going back and forth, right? It's not going to be contained in a single time frame, but just your awareness of it is going to go a long way, because you're going to be you're just going to hold space for it, and you're going to be looking for it and being open to, okay, let's stop. It seems like we need to have another little conversation about this,
So here's a question about grief and trauma and how they show up differently. And is there a difference in manifestation or healing?
Well, that's another workshop. Yes. On grief and trauma. I think that, there may be some similarities. And one of the things is that we look at this, what caused the experience, right? So if there's a loss, it could also be a traumatic loss, right? So we might have them commingling, right? If there was a death by suicide or a murder, or those experiences, a sudden accident, those are going to have trauma, and so then so how that impacts grief. I mean, I think talking about trauma is a whole nother conversation, but how it impacts grief is that we tend to have a prolonged grief, because a lot of times if it's a traumatic loss, or trauma has happened around close to it, or there's even a history of trauma before the loss, the beginning stages, the numbing and that shock can last much longer. And that can sort of extend the grief journey a little bit long, even though there's no time place. And it can also intensify the beginning of it. So it's, it's that can, I feel like it just, the biggest thing I can say is that it intensifies the experience. And then we would have to spend a little bit, we'd have to spend a longer period of time than we have right now, kind of talking about how that would be so and what you would do. Some of the basic premises of how you would be with someone are similar. They're same, but what we're looking for and maybe some of the coping mechanisms might be a little different depending on what the individual person has experienced.
I just want to take a quick pause. I noticed we've got some folks that are needing to jump off, and there was a little bit of a glitch with the evaluation link, but it's been fixed now. So if you need that and need to go, Megan has the link fixed. She works some kind of magic behind the scenes, which doesn't surprise me. So that link is there. We still have a few more questions and a little more time if folks have some additional questions they want us to ask Charlene. So,
Kelsey, there's one I see on there because I'm looking on them too that I want to talk about, because I think it comes up a lot. Because how is grieving for a departed pet different or similar to grieving for the loss of a human loved one? I mean, I think that's really important to bring up because, if we think our culture doesn't do very well at holding space for the loss, the death of humans, we really don't do well when it comes to pets. That's something that some people don't take seriously at all. Like, you might hear someone say, oh, it's just a dog, or if it's just a bird, or, and I think sometimes that loss can be more intense for a person than a human loved one, because we think about our pets and the unconditional love that they give to us, and how much time we might spend with them, or how much we might lean into them for emotional support. And so it can be quite painful and devastating. And so I think that a person will experience all of these things that we've been talking about today when they might experience that, and often do when they have when a pet dies. But what they're missing is the understanding from people in the culture. And I think that's a big deal. I'm reading all these, Kelsey, and I'm like getting excited. Like, I just want to spend time with each of the people here.
No, feel free to
someone
just
is
jump
pointing
into
out, someone's pointing out something that I feel is so important too. They're talking about it's so important to be culturally competent and educated. Being a Native American, I'm still finding it difficult to help clients who are mourning the loss of traditional way of practices. Also, in coping with the alteration of burial rites of our loved ones. It's a reminder of the historical losses tribal people have experienced. Thank you for that. I really just wanted to say that out loud because it is so important. And I talk a lot about that in some other grief workshops that I do, where we bring in culture, how people grieve in other cultures, and how people have been and how that way of grieving has been oppressed for many people and taken away from them by different, in different ways. So it's so important to bring that forward. So I'm very grateful for your comment about that.
Do you see others you want to take?
Oh yeah, I love them all. So
I know they're fantastic.
I do want to, because we are talking about during this time of the pandemic, there was someone who's supporting COVID patients and families remotely. And Owen said they'll be using this information with them. Many are not able to be with or see or talk to their loved ones. Any special suggestions to help these people? Yes, this is so hard. I mean, I think, we're not meant to grieve alone, and it's really hard to think about people dying alone also. And that's been one of the things that has hurt my heart quite a bit during this time. was to imagine people dying alone, and to imagine their loved ones not being able to get to them. So I mean, I feel like, that's where we want to just really be doing a lot of listening to the pain of that, right? And can we just be with the pain of that without trying to change it, without trying to fix it? And then there may be some things, creative things. I've had some clients do some very creative things using FaceTime and technology to get as close as they could to someone who has been dying, or or to have ceremonies after the death so loved ones could be together. But I think one of the things is, as you're supporting people, I think sharing this information is really good. Talking so much about how whatever ways we can reach out, and kind of helping people brainstorm those creative ways to be connected when we can't be together. And sometimes it's even energetically we have to do it, right? It's a prayer. It's a meditation. It's lighting a candle, and and crying as we think about them, because maybe the person's not in a place where they can even be aware of FaceTime or anything like that. So sometimes it's just being with the pain of it and doing what we can to send our love and to be as connected as we can during this time. It's really, really difficult. And I see, someone's asking, do I see this pandemic as a traumatic loss to those who lost their loved ones to COVID-19? I do think that is true, because it does have that quality of being, the suddenness of it, the initial, we're living the ambiguity and the uncertainness, and then this death happens to our loved one. That's, and there can be so many complicated feelings about that, about whether it's that you have a feeling of, why didn't, this testing happen sooner and this gets stopped, so maybe my loved one wouldn't have died, or why didn't, it could, all kinds of feelings that can come up. And I think that it can create that for many people. Not everyone will feel it as so much of a trauma, but many people might feel that that is true, especially if they've had other traumatic loss in their lives or other trauma in their lives, because it tends to, like I said, it tends to reawaken the pain of those times.
Charlene, there's a question here about resilience, and that we're not just dealing with the pandemic in isolation, that it's really layered upon, so many other concerns, political, climate change,
yes.
racial injustice.
Yes.
What kind of mindset or approach can help in walking through this really challenging time?
Yeah, I think that's that's an individual thing for sure. Each person is going to have a different combination of things that will help you walk through this time. For me, I feel like, for me, a lot of it is the guideposts. I think the guideposts are helping me with any number of those things that you just mentioned. And one of that, starting with acknowledging the pain of it, right? Acknowledging that this is true. And then feeling the pain of it, feeling all the the anger, the sadness, the injustice, just having those, having those feelings, and then being able to, I think being able to put that into action at some point is also helpful. And asking yourself those questions, what do I need right now? And what is being asked of me today can be helpful. And then it's like, what is being asked of me is a really important question when we start talking about racial injustice, or climate change or some of those other things. So I feel like one thing we can do is to acknowledge it, right? But that's only the beginning, you know, in those things. Acknowledging it and feeling our feelings about it has to lead to action, right? It's compassion in action. And so that, and we have to nurture ourselves so that we're not doing that from an empty fuel tank to be able to do it. But it is the way we find hope in those things, as to what, you know, and those actions are going to look different for each of us. But we do have to ask ourselves, what is it that we are called to do because that we live in this world? And can I do it with a great degree of compassion and kindness, but also at times be fierce about it? So I feel like, I mean, that's another whole webinar we could do to talk about that. But I feel like a lot of the basic material in this is like the foundation to help you, you know, be able to take action. And whether you're grieving the you know, the racial injustice, or you're grieving the climate changes, or you're grieving the political situation, it's, you know, democracy grief is a real thing that people are experiencing now. I think all, you know, we go back to these guideposts and as a foundation for our own unique response to this. Yeah, I'd love to talk to all of you for about, you know, and hear from you. I'd like to hear from you, other people, and be in conversation with any of you for, you know, for hours about that. Yes.
So we're going to have to close pretty soon, but there was one, there's one question, and, you know, that's asked a little different question. Not, you know, not everyone is experiencing a certain level of grief to the point that it's, you know, a loss. But for this person, they're thinking that they're feeling survivor's grief because this time, and in their own words, say that it's been very good to them. Any thoughts on how to work with that?
No, I think if, you know, in the times when you're not grieving and it's been very good to you, then you're in the great position of helping others. So that's not a bad thing. I think that if you're feeling like this is a time that's given you some gifts and you can see them and it's good to you, then it's, you know, then I would say that's great. You know, it's really good. I mean, it is. It's you don't have to be it's not like we have to be in pain and grieving unless we are. And when we aren't, it's like, so what can I offer to the world from this good place that I'm in?
All right, so I know we didn't get to all of our questions. I hope that maybe some of those questions got answered in some of the other questions that were asked, but I also know that Charlene has offered to be available if you want to reach out and get some additional information. So I think maybe her information has been shared in the chat box, but if we have that email or website, the best way to contact Charlene.
Yeah,
and we can
I don't know if it has been. I can put it in there right now myself.
Yeah.
So people will have, oops, I'll put my, oops. Thank you, Megan. That's my website. And you can also just, I'll put this email, my soul wisdom guide at gmail.com is an email that you can feel free to send me an email. And if you didn't get your question answered, I'm happy to answer it personally for you. I'm really happy to, anytime I can spread information about looking at grief differently and being with grief and being in conversation about grief, then I feel like that's a good day. And I'm very happy to continue this conversation beyond this webinar. And I'm really grateful for each and every person who came. I feel like it's an honor to have you here.
Yeah, we had quite a crowd. I think we had over 300 at one point. So that was great. So I'm just going to wrap up here. Again, express our gratitude to Charlene and her Forefront colleagues for partnering with us for this webinar. Let you all know that it takes us a couple days, but we will have the recording up, so you're welcome to share that recording. Somebody even mentioned in the chat that they're going to rewatch it again. Which is something I often do, and I often say redundancy builds fluency. So I think that's a great idea. And just want to thank folks for joining us. Take time to fill out the evaluation. If you haven't, it looks like Megan has put the link in the chat for where we will post the recording once it's available. And I think we will close out this webinar. We'll leave the room open just for a moment in case people are still trying to gather information from the chat. But I think I will just sign off and thank you again, Charlene, for your time. And
thank you.
Hope you get a chance to read some of the things that are in the chat. Lots of thank you and people that appreciated the time, and it was very powerful, and just appreciated your authenticity and insight. So hopefully you get a chance to scroll through those and see some of those notes. Those are very nice.
I am scrolling through them a little bit here. I see some of my
you recognize some
of my beloved friends and colleagues in there too, which is always fun.
It is fun.
Yeah, so great.
All right. Thank you very much. Be well, everyone.
Thank you all. Be well.